Hello, and welcome to Grand Final History. In this episode, we go back to 1940, the 44th season of the VFL. 1940 was a tumultuous year, with so much going on, some of it on the football field. We'll have a look at what was going on in Australia and in the world, and then focus on the VFL season, which again will involve talking about the VFA as the two rivals battled for football supremacy in Melbourne. The war in Europe was in an unusual phase in early 1940, known as the Phony War, where not much was happening in Western Europe. It was not so comfortable in Poland, divided by German and Russian forces, or in Finland, who were invaded by Russia. In the UK, there was even talk of a ban on bombing raids where civilians might be injured. The RAF was busy dropping propaganda leaflets over Germany. It all began to change in February, when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, which led to Chamberlain resigning and Winston Churchill becoming British Prime Minister. In May, Germany began their offensive through Belgium and the Netherlands, which would lead to the evacuation at Dunkirk and the fall of France in June. Italy entered the war on Germany's side. It was no longer a phony war. In response, the VFL made key changes during the season, which we'll get to shortly. I want to note now that almost 1,500 VFL footballers enlisted to serve in World War II, and 60 died on active service. During this episode and the others to follow, I will tell some of their stories, but I will not be able to mention all who enlisted. Let the stories of some honour all who served, whether footballers or not. In August, the Battle of Britain began in the air, and fears of an invasion grew. By September, the Blitz bombing campaign began, and London was bombed for 57 nights in a row. Australian efforts in World War II during 1940 involved naval forces serving in the Mediterranean and the dispatch of the army to North Africa in late 1940. Rationing was introduced and would become more extensive in the following years. In August, Australians were shocked when the crash of an RAF Lockheed Hudson attempting to land in Canberra killed the head of the Australian Army and 3 cabinet ministers, amongst the 10 passengers and crew. Prime Minister Menzies had to reshuffle his cabinet to replace the dead members of Parliament and called the pending election sooner than otherwise might have been expected, to avoid having 3 by-elections, which would then be followed by a general election. The weakening of the cabinet and the election, which resulted in a hung parliament, would in time lead to the fall of the Menzies government, and Labour, led by former Brunswick VFA player John Curtin, came to power in 1942. It has been called the plane crash that destroyed a government. Any government would struggle losing 3 ministers and the head of the army in one shocking moment. When it happened during the World War, the effect must have been immense. The British ship Dyer arrived in Sydney in September 1940, carrying prisoners of war and many refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe, but classed as enemy aliens. In the climate of fear, mistrust and ignorance, the refugees were interned in camps in New South Wales and Victoria, before this collection of musicians, artists, economists and scientists were released in 1941, some making Australia their home, and many contributing to the war effort and post-war reconstruction in Australia and elsewhere. Just 2 examples include Richard Sonnefeld, who was one of the chief translators at the post-war Nuremberg trials, and Franz Stampfel, who coached Roger Bannister, the first man to break the 4-minute mile, as well as many Australians across multiple Olympic Games. Melbourne Football Club relied on Franz for strength training in the late 1950s, as did Fitzroy at the start of the 1980s, one of the many refugees from World War II and after who would contribute to Australian football. 1940 also saw the first Jeep provided to the US Army as a prototype for a light reconnaissance vehicle. Countless more were produced, and Jeep would eventually become a popular car brand, well known as a sponsor of league football teams. Another development that would be fast-tracked because of the war was the development of penicillin. First identified in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, It was Australian Howard Florey with Ernst Haim at Oxford who found a way to scale up production and proved that it could protect mice from infection, a vital first step to allowing use on humans. That critical step would occur in 1941, and by the end of the war, penicillin, the world's first antibiotic, was being produced at industrial scale to save countless lives, as well as being used to treat numerous football players over the years. As 1940 unfolded, many sports were forced to make decisions whether they continue, alter operations, or suspend activities. Sports that stopped high-level competition in 1940 included Sheffield Shield cricket, golf, rowing, baseball, motor Grand Prix, and more. Football continued in Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, and Tasmania, as did rugby league in Sydney and Brisbane. Things would change in the coming seasons. Back in Melbourne, 1940 was to see a continuation of the battle between the VFA and the VFL, and the stakes were high. Let's have a look at some of the issues, which included more rule changes, pivotal decisions on grounds, stunning player recruitment battles, and much more. Clubs would be shaken, friendships broken, reputations blackened, and the consequences would echo for decades. Let's start with the money. Everything always gets back to the finances. VFA revenue was up significantly, albeit from a low base. VFL finances were strong at the league, but in clubland, there were strong clubs doing well, clubs like Hawthorn, who had improved and paid back their loans to the league, taken out in harder times a few seasons ago, and then there were the troubled clubs like North and South Melbourne, who were asking for loans of £500 and £1,000 respectively, quite a gap between the weak and strong clubs of the VFL. There was a battle over the MCG. VFA President J.J. Liston was thrilled when he could confirm the VFA had again locked in the Association Grand Final at the MCG for 1940, guaranteeing another large crowd for their showpiece game. He was stunned when just 3 days later, the Melbourne Cricket Club then locked the association out of the MCG for the weeks that Melbourne's senior team were playing away. A VFA game at the best, most central ground in Melbourne every second week would have been a huge win for the association. While the Melbourne Cricket Club gave with one hand, they took with the other. The VFL locking in exclusive use of the MCG during the season. Port Melbourne's president described the tactic of locking the VFA off the MCG during the football season as Chicago gangsterism. So, every second week, the best stadium in the land would host Melbourne's second A team in front of a handful of friends, family and officials. The cost of the VFL was high. They agreed to a 15-year deal and increased the percentage of the gate for the Melbourne Cricket Club from 10% to 12.5%, a revenue drain for the league that would be one of the catalysts for the development of their own stadiums. Firstly, VFL Park, and today, Docklands. Just one of the decisions made in 1940 that echoes down the decades. The association was strategic in the scheduling of their matches. Of the 120 games of the season, only 19 association games would be played in the same district as a VFL game on the same day, down from 39 the year before, reducing the temptation for football fans in those suburbs to choose the league over the association. Keeping the game moving to make it more attractive was the VFA's focus. While the league was locked in to 5 years with no rule changes as a part of the National Football Council, the association made their own decisions. Umpires bouncing the ball was the established tradition, but it did not always work. So in 1940, association umpires would throw the ball up, a change the league would eventually partially enact in 2013, 73 years after the VFA had dared to challenge tradition. While the league could not change the rules for playing the game, they were not standing still as the association challenged. Players seeking a clearance would need both club and now league approval to move to a VFA club. Zones would now be redefined and extended out into association club territory. And there was talk of 4 new clubs joining the league next season. Would that see 1, 2, or maybe 4 VFA clubs switch? Or would the VFL claim new territory? Supporters were having trouble keeping up with the implications of all these changes. And that's before we talk about players, current and those returning. Austin Robertson Sr., known as the fastest man in the world, was a well-known South Melbourne player and professional sprinter. He won the professional world title in 1930 and missed South Melbourne's 1933 Premiership when he went to the United States to challenge 1932 Olympic champion Eddie Tolan, but that match race fell through. Robertson had returned to Perth in 1937 for work when his employer, General Motors Holden, transferred him. But now it was 1940 and he was heading back to Melbourne. South Melbourne officials were delighted, and there was a delegation at Spencer Street to meet his train. There was also a delegation from Port Melbourne. South Melbourne was close to Austin's heart, but he was 31. His professional sprinting days were behind him. He was about to get married and start a family. Port Melbourne were offering £100 up front and £6 per week match payments, double the match payments South were allowed to offer. It was a straightforward decision. South Melbourne would not clear him, but he went anyway. Bob Pratt, champion full forward, wanted to play for Carlton, and he needed a clearance, which South Melbourne, of course, denied. So, after a tour of several VFA clubs and getting some advice from Carlton president Kenneth Luke on which team would be able to back up their financial promises, he also left South Melbourne without a clearance to play for more money at Coburg. His ankles had been causing problems. He wouldn't be playing football forever, and he needed to make the best use of his remaining time. South Melbourne, the glamour foreign legion of the 1930s, had spent the last 2 seasons on the bottom of the ladder, and now had lost Nash, Pratt, Fall and Robertson to ascendant VFA clubs. South Secretary Robert O'Brien said, "We cannot make head nor tails of the whole thing." The Ron Barassi name, father and son, is forever associated with Melbourne, but it may not have been so. At the end of May 1940, Ron Barassi Sr. was looking to play for Coburg. He had been something of a fringe player at Melbourne, and maybe he was looking to get a regular senior game with a little more cash. But the VFA Permit Committee insisted Barassi apply for a clearance, and that created enough delay for Barassi to change his mind and stay with the Demons. Which leaves us with an extraordinary what-if. What if Barassi Sr. had gone to Coburg? Would Norm Smith have felt the same responsibility for Ron Jr.? Would Melbourne have created the precedent for the father-son rule that is still with us today? Would Ron Jr. have gone to Melbourne? And what would his career have become if not in that all-conquering 1950s Melbourne team? Just a what-if, and, given Ron Barassi Sr.'s wartime sacrifice, that may have all turned out the same. But if not for the insistence of the VFA Permit Committee creating a delay in proceedings, who knows what might have happened? There is no more revered player at Richmond than Jack Dyer, the infamous Captain Blood of Tigerland. Yet early 1940 saw the Tigers and Dyer in turmoil. Dyer had been the heir apparent to the club captain and coach Percy Bentley. The committee had promised Bentley he would be coach in 1940, and the next month they reneged and went for Dyer, a situation not helped given Jack's father was one of the committee members. The Richmond Annual General Meeting in February had 2 tickets, a group of former players loyal to Bentley, looking to unseat the current committee and return the coaching role to Percy. Some similarities to the split at Collingwood the year before, but this time the incumbents were turfed out. It was a solid win. 439 votes to the Bentley team, 235 to the Dyer faction. After that nasty business had been dealt with, it was time for none other than Jack Dyer to come to the stage to receive his 1939 Best and Fairest Trophy, the award that has borne his name since 1964. In a sign of the bitterness on show that evening, amidst the cheers, there was a faint chorus of boos. Things got messy after that. There was talk that Dyer would stand down from the seniors and coach the seconds, or, More shocking news was then in the paper. Dyer to coach Yarraville. The application for a clearance was submitted to Richmond with Dyer's signature. Was the legend of Punt Road going to leave the club? Now, we know today that he stayed, but if you're a Tiger supporter in March 1940, it seemed like your worst fears were coming true. Plenty of VFL players from other clubs would have been delighted to take on Richmond without the threat of Captain Blood. Richmond's president, Harry Dyke, and a delegation of Richmond VIPs met with Jack. There was promises, perhaps, of coaching positions in a year to come, or maybe a cooling of tempers, or both. Jack was back, and, as he said in his biography years later, regardless of some of the riffraff that had joined the club. Before we can get to the season, there is one more club that was having their plans derailed in a most unexpected way. First, a little background. There was a young Collingwood centre half-back, Marcus Boyle, who had come third in the 1938 Best and Fairest. For reasons best known to himself, he decided to move to Adelaide to work as an assistant curator at Glenelg, with the aim of also playing for the Glenelg Football Club, without telling Collingwood. The first the Magpies heard about this was through the newspapers. They were adamant he would not be cleared. As they told their members, they had recruited Boyle, they had trained him, educated him in football, invested time, effort and money. He was a required player and he would not get a clearance. In the end, he stood out for all of 1939 and eventually got to play in 1940, winning the Margery Medal, and eventually returning to play some games for Collingwood during the war when his military service saw him stationed back in Melbourne. The message in 1940, though, was clear. If you were a required player, you were not going to get a clearance from Collingwood. Collingwood had a young forward who called the original champion full forward Dick Lee Uncle Dick, a young man who had served his apprenticeship alongside legendary full forward Gordon Coventry, a young man who kicked 4 goals in the Magpies' last premiership in 1936 when Coventry was suspended, a young man who had scored more than 100 goals in the last 2 seasons. Ron Todd, aged 23, had also just signed a blockbuster deal with Williamstown. When every player at Collingwood was on the same £3 per week, Todd's deal was jaw-dropping. £500 over 3 years with £100 up front and match payments of £6 per week. £500 in 1940 was enough to buy a 5-room house, a life-changing amount of money for this rising star of the game. But this was Collingwood, the team that had just played in the last 5 grand finals in a row for 2 premierships. The 5 weeks before the season opened would become a Shakespearean saga. Who the villain was might just depend on where you stood in the game. Todd became the focus of an unprecedented press scrutiny. 95 articles in the first 3 weeks of April alone. And in some ways, he was a pawn in the battle between 2 powerful football clubs. Williamstown, established in 1864, representing a unique maritime pocket of Melbourne. A VFA club since 1884, it had helped keep the association going through some of its dark times. Versus Collingwood, a younger club, yet the most successful in the VFL. If the press and the clubs were not enough, there was no shortage of attention and engagement from league and association officials, not to mention the sports-hungry public in Melbourne and beyond. The issue was reported across the country. Todd became an outcast at Collingwood. Officials would literally cross the road to avoid engaging with him. Then Todd began having second thoughts. He went back to Collingwood and met Jock McHale behind a shed at Victoria Park, when he should have been playing a practice game for Williamstown. He then pulled on a Collingwood jumper and played the second half of the practice match for Collingwood, and life at Victoria Park seemed to have returned to normal. But not quite. Things were just heating up. Todd was not going to get a clearance, and in a phone call with VFL Secretary that Saturday morning, he had been threatened with court action for breaching his VFL registration or Form 4 agreement that prohibited playing in any other competition without a clearance. Williamstown also threatened legal action. They had paid Todd £100 up front, sold many membership tickets to supporters on the basis of Todd playing, and they had a signed contract. The start of the season was approaching. If Todd played for Williamstown, he would be barred from the VFL or any National Football Council aligned competition for 3 years. Todd was both conflicted and confused, as demonstrated in the following week, when he both signed a variation to the Williamstown contract that provided more flexibility around training, while also engaging solicitor Frank Galbelli of Collingwood with instructions to return the £100 to Williamstown, something they had absolutely no intention of accepting. Yet if Todd was intending to return to Collingwood, there were plenty of other VFL clubs that would prefer that he didn't. The Magpies had won no friends with their continued success. Surely, Todd had breached the Kilda law by accepting the £100 up front, and he should be penalised. Hayden Button was not allowed to play for an entire season before his career even began, given his breaches of the Kilda law. But if he played for Williamstown and they were one of the clubs that came into the VFL in the next year, or if the VFA failed with the loss of 4 clubs, Todd would be out of football for 3 years. On the Thursday morning before the first game of the VFA season, Todd was saying he would play for Collingwood. Meanwhile, Footscray City Council was spending £250 of ratepayers' money to install additional gates, turnstiles and improved fencing at Yarraville, in anticipation of the bumper crowd when Williamstown, with Todd, played at Yarraville. He was selected in the Williamstown team for the opening round of the VFA, and he was also selected in Collingwood's side for their final practice match. Complicated. By Thursday night, with the certainty of a Williamstown injunction and a lawsuit, plus the likelihood of a VFL suspension under the Kilda law, the grim reality of his predicament, the result of his decision, meant that he had only one choice. Todd went to Collingwood Thursday evening to tell the club he would be playing for Williamstown. He would regret leaving the Magpies, but he had to honour his commitments. There was one final twist in the saga. As Todd prepared his kit for the game on Saturday morning, a telegram arrived from Collingwood, breaking their tradition, their core principle that every player was paid the same amount. They made one final, desperate plea. In your own interests, do not play for Williamstown. You will be looked after. The Magpies had the financial backing from colourful racing identity Jack Wren to match any offer. But they had held so long on to their principle, it was too late. In truth, it was too late once Todd signed the contract and took the first £100. Todd finally arrived at the Yarraville ground, dodging the massive crowd, dishevelled, grey-faced, tense, and with just 15 minutes to go before the game started. He was playing for Williamstown in the VFA, and for the first time in 35 years, Collingwood were without a star full forward. If you're wondering how Todd played after all that drama, he had a relatively quiet game, only 4 goals, but combined beautifully with Soapy Valance, who kicked a lazy 15 in an absolute thrashing of Yarraville, who would have been disappointed with the result, but thrilled with the packed house. The VFL didn't follow through with their threat to sue on the basis of Todd's Form 4 registration agreement. They knew, as was the case when Nash went to Camberwell in 1938, the registration contract was as watertight as a sieve. Todd became a pariah as far as Collingwood were concerned. It was an excommunication. Lou Richards would later say, "At Collingwood, the honour of wearing the black and white jumper is considered a privilege, and that Todd should want to forsake the jumper because of monetary gains was unforgivable in the eyes of most people at Collingwood." McHale made sure Todd's portrait was turned to face the wall. It would stay that way for 23 years. McHale told his players, "That's what we do to traitors." Todd's view was more pragmatic, as he said in 1950, "I do not want to become like one of those players in the past who has reached the top of the game and had no security. They drifted from job to job. The game and the crowd had finished with them." For Collingwood supporters, losing Todd would have been heartbreaking and unfathomable. What had just happened now? How could such a defection occur? But worse was to come. The Collier brothers, Harry and Albert, were retiring. The Collier name had been on the Magpie team sheets since 1925, when Albert made his debut, with Harry joining in 1926. They both wanted to play on. They both wanted a seventh premiership. They both felt they had more to offer the team, and most supporters agreed. But the match committee said no. Harry was 32, Albert 30. Albert's knees had been increasingly dodgy in recent years, and his last two grand finals in particular were very disappointing affairs. McHale wanted players that were 100% fit. The Magpies were to play 1940 without Todd and without the Colliers, except Albert did play one game in round 6 to qualify for his 15-year certificate. The club ran a testimonial year for the brothers, with colourful racing identity John Wren donating £200 of an eventual £500 to be shared between the both of them, showing that their years of service were being recognised, versus the £500 that Todd had just signed up for at Williamstown for 3 years. At Melbourne, supporters had worries of their own. Key big man Jack Mueller, one of their best players, had been approached by Paran with another big offer. Or had he? There were rumours, claims and denials. A stressful time for players, officials and supporters. While the VFA was challenging the VFL in Melbourne, we cannot ignore the efforts to promote the game internationally, a long-cherished hope for football administrators, which is yet to come to reality. In the modern era, Port Adelaide managed to play several games in Shanghai in an attempt to tap into the Chinese market. In 1940, there was a game played in Hong Kong by members of the Australian Naval Reserve in front of many local sports enthusiasts, with a very positive report in the South China Morning Post. The Football Record wondered, if a scratch match by naval reservists went down so well, how would a game played by VFL stars go? Later in the year, there were reports of games being played in India. International expansion is still a work in progress. While on the topic of football overseas, the record also noted that nearly 200 footballs had been sent to Australian armed forces serving overseas. Many more would be required. On to normal football matters now. Well, maybe. Football clubs have always had social outings, where teammates, officials, partners and supporters head out for an afternoon or an evening. They might visit a nearby venue, have something to eat, and quite often, something to drink. Maybe too much to drink. Maybe tempers get frayed. Maybe things get said. Maybe blows are exchanged. Maybe it all gets reported in the papers. North Melbourne went on a bay cruise on the paddle steamer Waroona in March. I'm sure it all started well, but it did not end well. Brawls erupted, punches were thrown, people pushed to the deck. It was too much for the captain, who finished the cruise early. The police were called. Stones were thrown as constables tried to intervene. A North Melbourne committee member, Fons Tobin, of the well-known funerals business, was charged and found guilty of behaving in an offensive manner, using indecent language, and resisting a policeman. He was fined £9. Seeking to clear his name and to counter the adverse publicity, he brought charges of perjury against 3 officers. Perhaps not the best strategy, as all the salacious details of the ill-fated cruise were reported again in the newspapers. All of the police were acquitted. They then successfully served Tobin with a writ seeking damages for malicious prosecution. Unable to pay the £2,359 damages awarded against him, he was declared bankrupt in January 1942. He would not be formally discharged until March 1971. He had to stand down as a director of the funeral business and sell his shares to his brother, but he did remain an employee. So, take care when you go on a club outing. The paddle steamer Waroona was itself conscripted into the war effort, leaving Melbourne in 1943, making her way to New Guinea as a convalescence and accommodation ship. It would eventually travel to Manila, and at the end of the war was towed all the way back to Sydney and broken up in 1951, never seeing Port Phillip Bay again. I suspect Fons Tobin and North Melbourne wished it had never ever been in Port Phillip Bay. In April, there was discussion and concern that trainers were being used to send messages from the coach out to the players. Runners were not allowed until 1955, and coaches in 1940 were asked to cooperate in not using trainers this way. Melbourne Secretary Percy Page suggested coaches should be allowed onto the playing arena. This would lift the standard of play. Page said coaches would be subject to the same laws as the players and able to be reported by umpires for unseemly conduct. Joe Kelly, the non-playing coach of Footscray, noted the advantage of playing coaches in being closer to the players. He proposed that coaches be allowed to address players at quarter time and three-quarter time. The AFL Rules webpage says this did not happen until 1964. All the coaches were invited to a conference at Harrison House mid-April to discuss, amongst other things, the need to present cleaner football to the public. Spoiler alert, it did not work. Whether it was the wartime atmosphere or disruptions in team selection as players enlisted and were required for military training or service, 1940 would go down as the most violent season yet, at least in terms of reports. A record 47 players were reported across the season. Meanwhile, Essendon made a significant change, choosing the Bombers mascot with an attractive gilt airplane badge available for supporters who would need to make the change from calling their team the Same Olds or the Red and Blacks. The proximity to Essendon Airport was the catalyst for the name, although not specifically mentioned in the Argus announcement. While on the topic of mascots, Fitzroy were having second thoughts about the gorilla mascot. It hadn't brought them any luck, and they were going back to the Maroons, as per a number of articles in February and March. I suspect Fitzroy's lack of success was a bit more fundamental than the choice of mascot, but it seems we need to refer to them as the Maroons this season. In recent years, there has been much debate on the merits of a wildcard round to add interest to the late season games. Well, it's all been discussed before, this time in 1940. Geelong's delegate proposed an expansion to the finals with what we would now call a wildcard round. His submission proposed that third would play fifth and fourth would play sixth in a double header at the MCG. That could attract 80,000 spectators. The winners of each match would then contest the first semi-final the following week, and a week later, first and second would play off in the second semi-final, as per usual. Not sure of the impact of 2 weeks off for first and second, followed by another week off while the preliminary final was being played, although the scheme was sure to raise more revenue, which could be given to patriotic funds. There was not enough support, and the finals proceeded in the now traditional manner. The coaching merry-go-round started up again in 1940 after a quiet couple of seasons. There were 5 new coaches, a replacement rate that had been the norm for most of the previous decade. Essendon's Dick Reynolds was now appointed for his first full season after taking over partway through 1939. Hawthorn veteran Bert Mills replaced Len Thomas at the Mayblooms, while Len moved after one respectable season from Hawthorn to North Melbourne. Clearly, he did not mind a challenge. Jack Baggott had left Essendon midway through the last season, but now would be taking on South, who, as we have heard, would be without Pratt and had not been able to regain Robertson. Another tough coaching job. Dan Minogue is a man that we've been following since his debut with Collingwood in 1911, a year before Jock McHale took over as coach. Minogue broke his collarbone in his debut game, missed 9 weeks, but was back in the team for the grand final, breaking his collarbone again, but playing the game out, carrying the painful injury and the hurt of losing the premiership. By 1914, he was captain of Collingwood. After his World War I service, he wanted a transfer from Collingwood to the Tigers and had to stand out of the game for 12 months. He captained Coach Richmond to back-to-back premierships before finishing his playing career at Hawthorn with 1 game in 1926, when he then became non-playing coach. After coaching also at Carlton and St Kilda and now Fitzroy, he had the unique record of coaching 5 clubs as well as playing at 3. Senior roles at 6 of the 12 VFL clubs over 30 years for 2 premierships at Richmond and coaching runners-up at Carlton in 1932 against the Tigers. I wonder if Minogue spoke to Ron Todd, given that his photo was also turned to the wall when he left the Magpies for Richmond. There was a wonderful article on Minogue and the infamous photo in the 2014 Grand Final record. I'll put a link on the grandfinalhistory.au website for this episode. While debate about the dropping the ball rule or the throwing the ball rule would continue, two minor changes were introduced in 1940. In an effort to reduce congestion at the centre bounces, the centre circle was enlarged from 2.4 metres to 3 metres, and, to help avoid confusion with goal umpires recording the score, fullbacks now had to wait until the umpire had finished waving their flags before kicking out, a rule that was eventually rescinded in 2006 to speed the game up. The opening round was on a bright, sunny Saturday the 27th of April. Any soldier, sailor or airman in uniform and on leave could get a free ticket from Anzac House. Another sign this season was going to be different to 1939. Supporters and some military personnel combined for a healthy crowd of 111,000 across the 6 games. Reigning premiers Melbourne went to Windy Hill, with Fred Fanning making his debut in the forward line after his 12-goal effort in the Reserves Grand Final in 1939. But Essendon spoilt Fred's debut and the Demons' Day, leading at every break and winning by 17 points. Carlton broke a bit of a hoodoo and beat Geelong at the Corio Oval. South Melbourne put in a respectable effort against Collingwood, kicking 5 goals in the last quarter, but falling short by 12 points. They gave the Magpies too much of a head start. Was it a good sign for the Swans, or a warning for Collingwood? Dan Minogue's tenure at Fitzroy got off to a good start, the Maroons beating last year's preliminary finalist St Kilda by 11 points, their first opening round win in 8 seasons. Richmond were at home, hosting Footscray, but when Jack Dyer went off in the first quarter, the Tigers were, as the Age said, like a rudderless boat. The Bulldogs held on for a 2-goal win. The biggest surprise of the day was Hawthorn absolutely thrashing North Melbourne, with Alec Albertson kicking 10 goals for the Maybloons. It meant, for the first time after joining the VFL in 1925, Hawthorn were on top of the ladder, quite a different view from their familiar location. After all the drama and the uncertainty due to the war, the player transfers to the VFA, and the social trips gone bad, the season was underway, with the 4 finalists from 1939 being defeated. It was not going to be smooth sailing in 1940. One challenge for all clubs would be getting a consistent team onto the field, as players enlisted and their availability was restricted due to military training. It would lead to a number of inconsistent results throughout the season. It would be a test of the depth of playing talent across all the clubs. While the focus of this podcast is the VFL's history, it is worth noting the extraordinary effort of South Australian member of the Australian Football Hall of Fame, Ken Farmer. The North Adelaide player was often called the Bradman of football, and in the opening round of the 1940 Sandful season, he kicked 9 goals and 6 behinds out of a total North Adelaide score of 9 goals, 10 behinds. One of the many goal-kicking achievements in a career based entirely at North Adelaide, despite the best effort of many VFL clubs. Farmer finished his 242-game career on 1,417 goals, at an average of 6.3 goals per game, well ahead of the likes of Coventry, Coleman, Hudson or Lockett, a champion footballer. One consequence of round 1 in the VFL was St Kilda captain-coach Ansel Clark's decision to retire as a player. It was his 3rd year at St Kilda after starting his career at Carlton in 1929. After 169 games, he felt that it was time to allow younger players to take the field while he focused on coaching. Stan Lloyd was appointed captain for the rest of the season. One of those young players for St Kilda was none other than Keith Miller, recruited from Brighton after holding Bob Pratt to 1 goal in round 3 of the VFA. Miller was playing his first game for the Saints a week later against North. His career with St Kilda was interrupted by the war, only playing 2 seasons before serving in the RAAF. He played 50 games all up, but is better known as a cricketer, one of the great all-rounders of the game. Who knows what he might have achieved for St Kilda with that extraordinary sporting talent, if not for the war. When the season started, the war in Europe was in its holding pattern. But that all changed during May when Germany invaded Belgium and the Netherlands, and by the end of June 1940, the war in Europe had reached a very dark phase. Paris was occupied, France had fallen, the British forces had evacuated at Dunkirk, leaving behind equipment and armour, and Churchill had given his famous "We will fight them on the beaches" speech. The impact on the VFL and clubs was significant given this serious turn of events. Some of the decisions made in this period were the cancellation of the Hobart Interstate Carnival. Collingwood players requested their pay be cut from £3 to £1. The VFL decided all player payments would drop from £3 to £1 10 shillings, or effectively £1.50, and the 2p increase in admission from 1939 that was supposed to be dedicated to ground improvements would now go to patriotic funds. This was on top of the 5% of all gate receipts that had been earmarked for patriotic funds since the start of the season. Carlton donated their Provident Fund, money set up for retiring players who played a minimum number of matches over a minimum number of seasons. The entire fund of £1,026 was donated, plus £400 from the club, confirmed by the committee. While players were happy to take the pay cuts, if the funds saved were going to patriotic funds, there was some serious grumbling when it became clear that some clubs were using the savings to pay off debts. But if crowd numbers were down, then the less powerful clubs were going to have trouble staying viable, given they were barely breaking even before the war started. Times had changed, and while the football season would continue, the focus on raising funds for the war effort was on everyone's mind. There were calls to bury the hatchet between the VFL and the VFA, so football could be controlled by one overarching body. But it was not to be. One of the fundraising efforts that does look odd from our modern era was the Fags for Fighters campaign. A number of special sporting events and novelty matches were being held specifically to raise funds to purchase cigarettes for servicemen on the front lines. We now know the health risks of cigarettes, but arguably, if you're fighting in a war, there are more pressing health risks than those associated with cigarettes. The end of May saw trouble in Geelong. The selection committee did not support Reg Hickey continuing as playing coach. Age had caught up with the veteran, and he'd only been able to play 3 of the first 5 games. However, he was not willing to continue as non-playing coach, and resigned both as player and coach. Reserves coach Les Laver, who initially knocked the job back because of business commitments, would become the new non-playing coach for the remainder of the season. He had a track record of success. In 12 years, the reserves team had not missed the finals, and they had won 3 premierships. The start of June saw 6 rounds, or 1/3 of the season, complete, and, as the Herald noted in their review, the clubs were falling into various categories reflecting their strength and prospects, despite some unusual results. The top 4 were Richmond, Melbourne, Carlton and Geelong, all on 4 wins, separated only by percentage. Then St Kilda, Footscray, Collingwood and Essendon, all on 3 wins, followed by North Melbourne, South Melbourne, Hawthorn and Fitzroy, all on 2 wins. It was an unusual ladder for an unusual season. While the top 4 teams might be favourites for finals at this point, teams from 5th to 8th would be looking forward to the next set of games to stake their claims for the top 4. Footscray needed to stop fading out at the end of games, and St Kilda needed to show more on the field rather than just looking like strong teams on paper. Hawthorn had never looked like a finalist, but they defeated reigning premiers Melbourne in round 6. Perhaps they were the enigma team for this season, yet they had not won an away game in more than 2 seasons. Strong home performance would only get them so far. The Mayblooms were about to start creating problems for themselves, though. Kevin Curran was an 18-year-old lad, recruited from Traralgon. Chairman of selectors Albert Hyde had signed him up, but recommended that he be given a decent spell in the seconds to get used to league football. But his performances were so good that he was selected for his debut game in round 7 against Fitzroy at the Brunswick Street Oval. In the modern era, debut games are celebrated. We see videos of the coach telling a youngster he's going to play in his first game. Parents and family are brought to the ground. A celebrated veteran will present the nervous lad with his jumper. Obviously, that sort of thing wasn't happening in 1940, but nor would a raw 18-year-old playing in his first game expect to be abused heckled and yelled at by a vice president and committeeman of his own club. Jim Maguire was unhappy that a player that used to work for him had been dropped for Karen. He was yelling out things like, "You shouldn't be in the side, Karen." It was an ugly scene. Chairman of Selectors, Albert Hyde, quit the club in disgust, becoming president of the East Brunswick Football Club, and Karen only played that one game in 1940 before enlisting in the army and performing some exceptional deeds in the Pacific War in Timor and New Guinea. He would return to Hawthorn in 1946, eventually being appointed captain amidst more controversy in 1950, but that's a story for another time. Let's just be glad most debut players are allowed to celebrate their first game without being abused by their own committee members. Round 7 was also the last game for Len Thomas. He had taken over as the playing coach of North Melbourne after a season coaching Hawthorn and a long career at South. Now he was enlisting. As he told Hector Lacey in the Sporting Globe, "Well, a man can't be out of a thing like this." Even though, aged 32, he was married with 2 children. Thomas was the first league captain to enlist. Jim Adamson, a veteran with the shin boners, would take over as playing coach for the remainder of the season. Len Thomas would serve in the Middle East, being promoted to corporal. When he returned to serve in New Guinea, he requested to revert to a private so he could serve as a commando. He was one of the most experienced VFL players to lose his life, killed by the Japanese in New Guinea in 1943, one of the many players that lost their lives in service. Essendon captain coach Dick Reynolds, his brother Tom and their family had to deal with the sudden death of their father, William Reynolds. William was a wholesale butcher, and in mid-June 1940 he'd returned to work after 3 weeks' holiday. While making a delivery in High Street Q, he collapsed over the steering wheel. A doctor from a nearby clinic attended and rushed back to his clinic to call an ambulance. While that was happening, William recovered, decided he was fine, and drove off. A few minutes later, he had another seizure, lost control of the truck, which then collided head-on with the tram. William died at the scene. The tram driver and 3 other passengers were injured, and the tram was severely damaged. Both Dick and Tom Reynolds missed the Round 8 game against Carlton, but the Bombers still beat the Blues. Fitzroy almost pulled off an upset against ladder leaders Melbourne in Round 8. But as often seems the case, luck, or poor umpiring decisions, go the way of the top-of-the-table teams. Late in the last quarter, the Maroons had got the ball to Keith Forbes, who ran forward and kicked the goal that would have given them the lead. Except, instead of signalling all clear, the umpire penalised Forbes for running too far, a decision that just confused everybody. Melbourne then raced the ball to their end, picked up a couple of behinds just before the bell rang to scramble a 2-point win in a game that should have gone the other way. After the game, Melbourne officials admitted they had been very lucky to win. Round 10 saw the unusual situation of the top 5 clubs level on points. Richmond on top, then Footscray, Melbourne, Geelong and Essendon, all just separated by a percentage. Fitzroy was 6th, beating a struggling Collingwood, but 2 games behind Essendon, making it hard for them to challenge for the finals. That free kick in the dying stages of the Round 9 game could be more costly than anyone expected. Melbourne and Geelong had a shootout at the MCG in Round 10, setting a league record for the highest scoring game. Geelong winning by 4 points, with 24 goals 10, 154, to Melbourne's 22, 19, 150. Ron Barassi Sr. had that schoolboy's dream turn to a nightmare with a kick after the bell from half forward, which could have won the game for the Demons. Distance was fine, but accuracy was a problem, scoring one behind rather than the goal needed for the win. Hawthorn had been top after Round 1, but by Round 10 they were back at the bottom of the ladder. Yet they did have their first away win in 3 seasons and their first ever win at Princes Park, when they beat Carlton by 7 points. Melbourne had to make an unusual change to their team for their Round 11 game against South Melbourne. Captain Alan Lafontaine was out, not injured, nor suspended, and not being rested. Rather, he was getting married in the middle of the football season, while the game was being played. At least Bob Pratt scheduled his wedding service after the game when he got married during the 1935 season. It meant Les Jones, who'd been a regular player between 1933 to 39, returned for a short stint after transferring to captain-coach Terang at the start of the season. Terang's season had been ended due to the war. After round 12, the season was two-thirds complete, and the ladder was beginning to separate. Melbourne was now on top, with a much better percentage than Geelong, second, also on 9 wins, and Richmond was third, with Essendon in the 4, a game ahead of Footscray, but the Bulldogs' percentage was much better than the Bombers. Collingwood and Fitzroy were 6 and 7, 2 games behind Essendon. They still would have held out some hope, though. Several of the teams above them had to play each other, and that might open a window if they could win all of their games. South were on the bottom with 3 wins. Hawthorn were just ahead of them. North and St Kilda had 4 wins, and Carlton were 8th on 5 wins. The Blues were in the mathematical possibility territory, but their season really hadn't got started, and a 1-point loss to Geelong in round 12 had not helped their cause at all. The first week of August was scheduled as a bye round for the Hobart Interstate Carnival. However, that had been cancelled long ago, and for the first time in league history, every club would play on the MCG on the same day in a special Lightning Premiership to raise funds for the war effort. 11 games were played as 2 10-minute halves, with a couple of minutes to change over. There was no time on, and if scores were level at full time, the umpires would bounce the ball in the centre, and the first team to score would win. Play was scheduled to start at 11:30. The 4 lowest teams would play each other, with the 2 winners going directly to the semi-finals. They had an easier path than the top 8 teams, who would play a knockout round, with the 4 winners playing in another knockout round, leaving 2 of the top 8 to play in the semi-finals, leading to a grand final. 30,407 people paid to watch the game, and it is sometimes said that the players even paid admission to get into the ground, but that didn't happen, as reported in The Age. Players felt that they were already giving up their usual match fees, and the early start to play meant that many were missing a half-day's work on Saturday morning, so the players got tickets to attend. St Kilda won their opening round against Hawthorn, and then beat Carlton in the semi-final to face off against Richmond. The Saints had beaten Richmond at the MCG in the 1939 semi-final, although their 1940 season had not gone to plan, and they were sitting 9th on the ladder with only 5 wins. But they were far too good for the Tigers, winning the league's Patriotic Premiership by 24 points. Perhaps the extra game meant the Tigers were just a bit slower than St Kilda. It was the Saints' first ever premiership. There was a Patriotic Premiership flag and a Premiership Cup for the club and replicas for the players. There were celebrations in the change rooms, and club president, Councillor Mitty, said the players would have a celebration dinner on the following Wednesday, followed by a night at the theatre. It may not have been the premiership they were aiming for at the start of the season, but it was a premiership and it would be enjoyed. The event raised £2,720 for the war funds. There is a short film of the game, and I'll put a link up on the grandfinalhistory.au site for this episode. If you looked at about the 23-second mark, there is a superb fend-off by Jack Dyer, the equal of any Dusty Martin don't argue efforts 8 decades later. With 3 games remaining in the season, Richmond, Fitzroy and Essendon were all level on points, with 3rd, 4th and 5th spots respectively on percentage. Footscray was 7th, a game behind, not giving up hope of a finals berth, but needing other results to go their way. The Saints unfurled their first premiership flag before the round 15 game against Footscray, but it was the Bulldogs that won that game. Essendon hosted Fitzroy at Windy Hill in a must-win game for each team. Alan Hurd was so focused on the game that he took a mark even when Keith Sackpole Sr.'s defensive efforts resulted in the loss of Alan's shorts. Undaunted by the lack of shorts and laughter from the crowd, Hurd took his shot, kicking the ball into the man on the mark, then chasing after the ball to clear it to a teammate before eventually looking for another pair of shorts. Not sure if his son Alan or grandson James Hurd would have done the same. It did not get Essendon their win though. Fitzroy kept their finals hope alive with a 3-point win. The round 16 game between Richmond and Fitzroy was crucial for both clubs, and at three-quarter time, only a goal separated the teams. But the Tigers finished well for a 4-goal win that left the Maroons 6th, behind Footscray 5th, and both a game behind Essendon. Complicating matters was Geelong's unexpected loss to 11th place South Melbourne. The Cats went down by 4 points. This meant Richmond was 2nd, Geelong dropped to 3rd, and Essendon's win over Hawthorn had them back in the 4. All 3 teams on the same points, with 2 games to go. The only team guaranteed a final spot was top-placed Melbourne. Round 17 saw the Maroons in yet another do-or-die game against Carlton, who were 7th. But perhaps the pressure was too much for Fitzroy, and they received a 69-point belting by the Blues. Footscray was the other team that was trying to sneak into the finals. If they could beat Geelong, their better percentage would get them into the top 4. Sometimes, brave predictions take a long time to be proven wrong. The Age reported that coach Norm Ware gave an inspiring speech after the Thursday night training, saying he wanted a bit extra from everyone, and we can beat Geelong at Geelong, Darwin, or anywhere. Sadly for the Bulldogs, they did not beat Geelong in round 7 1940, and when they played Geelong in Darwin in July 2020, the Cats also won. The 1940 victory locked the Cats into a final spot, and, unknown to all of those at the game, it was the last time Geelong played a league game at the Corio Oval. More on that in the next episode. The top 4 teams all won their round 17 games, and the question of who was going to make the finals was now resolved. It was just the order that had to be clarified. Richmond had no problems against South, so they held on to second spot. The match of the day was at Windy Hill, where Essendon hosted Geelong, and a confidence-boosting result for the Bombers, who won by 60 points. It was noted that once the half-time scores from the Richmond-South game had been seen, many of the Geelong players took the second half easy. Some not even on the ground at the start of the third quarter. Others clearly saving themselves for the semi-final, which would also be against the Bombers the next week. Essendon would play Geelong at the MCG for the first semi-final, with Melbourne taking on Richmond the following week, the winner of that second semi progressing directly to the grand final. Carlton, a mathematical possibility for finals position with 2 games to go, had finished the season well, but were a game behind on 5th spot, winning the 1940 Almostess Award for just missing out on the finals. Footscray was 6th, an improvement on their 1939 result, and Fitzroy, after starting the season slowly, had challenged at times for a final spot, but lacked consistency, missing the finals yet again. Collingwood, the runners-up the year before, had struggled all year. The loss of Ron Todd, the gap left by the Collier brothers, and an ageing team all told, finishing in an unexpected 9th spot. Hawthorn and South both had 7 wins, good results given their recent performance, but not enough to get close to finals. St Kilda were second last with 5 wins, but their first ever premiership with the Patriotic Cup taking pride of place on their trophy shelf. And North Melbourne, even though they'd won 4 games, had yet another wooden spoon. On the Wednesday evening, after the end of the home and away season, the Brownlow medal votes were counted, resulting in one of the award's most unusual outcomes. Collingwood's Des Fothergill and South Melbourne's Herbie Matthews polled 7 best of fields, 4 2-vote games, and 3 1-vote games. It was a tied result, and there was no splitting them. They played the same number of games, polled the same number of votes, achieving an unbroken record of 32 votes in an 18-round season, not beaten until Collingwood's Dane Swans' 34 votes in 2011 in a 21-round season. League Secretary, like McBrien, was, perhaps, inspired by Erwin Schrödinger's 1935 thought experiment, known as Schrödinger's cat, where, without going into all the details, a cat may be considered simultaneously alive and dead. In 1940, McBrien reported that the Brownlow medal had neither been won nor lost. The league resolved the impasse by retaining the original Brownlow medal and awarding each player replicas with the wording tied for best and fairest. It was not until 1989, when the league awarded medals to all players that had missed out through ties, that both Matthews and Fothergill got their own Brownlow medal. South had endured some difficult seasons, but at least they could cheer for a Brownlow medalist. Collingwood had lost Ron Todd, retired the Collier brothers, missed out on the finals, but at least they had 20-year-old Des Fothergill, already with 3 Copeland trophies and now a Brownlow. That should help in the next season. And yet another sign of the times, and a reflection on the desire to show patriotic support for the country, the league delegates confirmed that the national anthem would be sung before the finals, accompanied by a band with the players, umpires and spectators singing God Save the King, a tradition that continues to this day with the switch to Advance Australia Fair in 1977, although a verse of God Save the Queen was played after Advance Australia Fair all the way up to 1983. The first semi-final was Essendon's first visit to finals since 1926. It was Dick Reynolds' first full season as coach, after taking over during the 1939 season, and he had helped lift the club. But after 14 years, were they there to make up the numbers, or did they have a real chance? Geelong's season had not gone as expected, with the departure of the Premiership coach Reg Hickey and the eventual move of seconds coach Les Laver, getting the clubs to finals action for another season. Essendon had defeated Geelong twice this season. Could they make it 3 from 3? The first person at the ground was 13-year-old Florence Barclay from Richmond, who took her spot at the gate at 7 a.m. She spent her time knitting khaki socks until the gates opened at 11, with the seconds game starting at 12. Eventually, 51,411 were at the ground as the clubs faced up to each other for the second week in a row. Most of the previews had favoured the Dons. The game could be defined as one of two halves. The first saw Essendon well on top, playing with confidence, linking together and scoring freely. At the long break, the Bombers were well in front, 11 goals 10, 77 to Geelong, 5 goals 3, 33. A 44-point lead at half-time is usually enough to win most games. Yet in the second half, Geelong made some wise positional changes, played the superior football, and if they'd managed to kick a goal with a bit more care, they might have pulled off an amazing result. In reality, they had given the Dons too much of a lead, and the 3-goal loss was just one of many semi-final defeats Geelong had suffered over the decades of VFL football. The final scores were Essendon 13 goals 14, 92 to Geelong 10 goals 14, 74. It was a memorable day for Essendon full forward Tom Reynolds. 3 goals, a win, and then he got married Saturday evening after the game. I can only assume the honeymoon had to wait until after the finals. The second semi saw Melbourne taking on Richmond, clearly the best two teams of the season. Melbourne made 4 changes to the team, including dropping Bluey Truscott to the bench. He'd missed 11 games during the season, through injury, illness and military service, but played in the last 2 home and away games. Perhaps Melbourne selectors were not fully convinced of his fitness, but he was too good a player to drop altogether. The Herald tipped the Tigers, even though they had not defeated Melbourne since the opening round of the 1939 season. 54,700 were at the ground, with the band again leading the players and spectators in a rendition of God Save the King. It was hoped for an improvement on the first semi-final, where the crowd was silent, with the exception of one solitary voice from the football reserve. When the band did lead off, the singing from the standing, bare-headed crowd was hushed but unanimous, with the now traditional cheers as the anthem came to a close. Supporters could also contribute to a collection to aid victims of Germany's ruthless bombing of British civilians. The game was a significant improvement on the first semi-final, with the lead changing and the momentum ebbing and flowing. Melbourne got the first 2 goals of the game, but errors from both sides saw gettable shots missed. The second quarter saw Richmond get onto a run, which stretched their lead to 3 goals. Just before half-time, there was one of the most sensational incidents of the entire season, between 2 of the giants of the game at the height of their powers. Richmond's Jack Dyer and Melbourne's Norm Smith. I'll let Norm Smith tell what happened. This description was the foreword to Jack Dyer's autobiography published in the 1960s. A chilling sensation of fear. The hair prickled on the back of my neck. I couldn't see the danger, but I sensed it. Crash! The shock of the impact was unlike anything I had experienced before. There was a floating sensation of unreality as I crashed face first in the turf. A yellow light flashed across my eyes. No human could hit that hard, but then I've often wondered if Jack Dyer was human. The immortal Captain Blood is a legend in his own lifetime. His story is the story of Australian rules football. He was 6 foot of iron-hard muscle and probably the toughest and most colourful player ever to pull on football boots. I've had many clashes with Dyer, but the one that stands out the most in my memory was in the 1940 semi-final, where he slammed me into the turf with the hardest shirt front I've ever received in football. There was nothing unfair. I was playing the ball and was careless. He hit me at full pace with his shoulder. I felt it was coming, even though I didn't see him. It seemed like hours before I could lift myself from the turf. I had no idea what was going on. I sagged as I was handed the ball for a penalty kick against Dyer. I shouldn't have got one, but the umpire must have felt sorry for me. I didn't know where to kick. In fact, I didn't know where I was. I collapsed at half-time with a concussion. Richmond, with a vastly inferior side, went on to beat us that day, and I consider the 1940 Melbourne side the greatest in the history of the game. And Richmond were just a team. That was the effect of Dyer. His strength and courage was a spur to the side. He lifted and inspired them to unbelievable heights. Jack Dyer also described the incident in his own words. There's always a special feeling when you get one of the smart guys. The guys who are so slick and skilled they think they'll never be caught. Like Norm Smith. Norm has the ball. I had the hip and shoulder. I saw a blazing red head weave through a pack. I had a clear shot at Norm Smith. Norm made that one mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. He balanced himself for a kick at goal without taking a quick look around. He was positioned perfectly for a legitimate shirt front. I gathered speed and got fully into stride as he lined up his shot. I hunched my shoulder as Norm bent a little low in his turn. Dyer described it as the hardest shirt front he ever delivered. Smith said it was the hardest bump he ever received. The Melbourne supporters were incensed. Melbourne players ran in to remonstrate with Dyer. The umpire, Alan Coward, reprimanded Dyer and awarded a free kick to Smith, a kick he had to take. Unlike the VFA, there was no option to transfer the kick to a teammate. It was a dazed and concussed Smith to kick the ball or a ball up. Smith missed his shot at the goal and staggered around on the ground until the bell went. He collapsed in the rooms at half-time and was taken to Prince Henry's Hospital, remaining under observation until 8 p.m. Melbourne's 19th man, Louis Truscott, came onto the ground after half-time, but injured his leg early in the third quarter. The game again ebbed and flowed before the Tigers got another run of goals, with two to Robert de Caris, followed by Jack Titus, and then wingman Alec McDonald, and it looked like the game was decided, until Melbourne steadied. Hersey Beams kicked a long, raking drop kick. Truscott was troubling the defenders, even with his injured leg, and Mueller was impressive, alternating between taking on Dyer in the ruck or holding down centre-half forward. A decisive 35-point advantage to the Tigers was whittled back, goal by goal. And when the bell went for three-quarter time, Richmond's lead was just 3 points. It had been a wonderful, hard quarter of football, worthy of the top two teams. Melbourne struggled a little in the last quarter. They had several injured players and had used up so much in that remarkable comeback, they were nearly spent. Strong work by the Tigers' defence, followed by goals to Dick Harris and two to Jack Titus, meant that Truscott's goal on the last kick of the day was not enough to change the result. A 3-point win for the Tigers, a classic bruising encounter. Truscott had kicked 4 goals in one half of football, virtually on one leg, while Richmond's skinny Jack Titus had got 5, getting him to 97 goals, edging closer to that magic 100 for the season. Was Dyer's shirt front on Norm Smith fair? Was it legal? Despite what Smith wrote in Dyer's biography, the pair debated the point for decades. Smith said Dyer had used his elbow. Dyer maintained that he'd used his shoulder, claiming Smith's teeth marks were imprinted on his shoulder. Smith retorted that his teeth would not have been a match. Smith once told Dyer that he would have been a better player if he played the ball more, but they both enjoyed each other's company and had plenty of beers over the years, despite the differing versions of events. The preliminary final was held on a wet Saturday, with the MCG more like a quagmire than a football ground. Truscott had to be replaced because of his injured leg, but Norm Smith wasn't going to let a small thing like concussion keep him out of a game, and he trained normally during the week. Despite the weather, 47,348 were at the game. Essendon had a surprise visitor to their rooms before the game. Jack Dyer received a warm welcome when he dropped in to wish Dick Reynolds and the team good luck. This week, the crowd sung the anthem with enthusiasm and drive. The Sun reported that never before has a great old tune been sung so fervently by such a tremendous choir. I guess people took a few weeks to get used to singing before a football game, or perhaps it was a show of patriotism, given the challenging news from Britain and the progress of the war. It was an even first quarter with some hectic and physical football played. Essendon's Ted Bryce got the first 2 goals of the second quarter, and Melbourne was showing signs of being rattled. But it was only a 3-point lead, quickly recovered with goals to Albie Rodder and Norm Smith, who was playing well despite the knock from the previous week. The game began more physical during the second quarter, with Rodder, Percy Beams and Ron Baggett all being knocked over. The half-time score was Melbourne 8 goals 11 to Essendon 8 goals 8. The 3-point gap was a reflection of 2 even teams, each getting a run of goals before the other would surge back. Albie Rodder was in a bad way at half-time, concussed by one of the many blows exchanged, but Melbourne officials decided to send him out for the second half. Essendon took off Les Bagley, who had injured his shoulder, bringing 19th man Wilson into the game. During the third quarter, Melbourne lost Wally Locke, who had injured his ankle and had to be carried off. Bill Baxter came off the bench, but almost immediately injured himself. Given there were no more substitutes, he was sent up forward with Hall going to fullback. Players on both sides were hurting. The stakes could not be higher, a chance for the Premiership or the end of the season. Everything was set for a climactic final quarter. The ground had been watered on the Friday, and then heavy rain fell during the night. But it had been largely dry for the first 3 quarters, and the MCG had been very muddy, but playable. That was all about to change. Not long after the start of the last quarter, a pounding rainstorm swept over Melbourne. The ground was covered in miniature lakes, and a difficult game had become a grinding slog. Despite the conditions, the lead changed multiple times. The crowd was soaked to their skin, shoes were full of water, but they were enthralled by the game. The ball was often kicked along the ground, yet Harry Ball was still able to take some great high marks in the Melbourne backline, repelling Essendon attacks. At one point, Essendon's Ted Bryce and Melbourne's Richie Emsell were struggling in Essendon's goal square. The ball came off Emsell's boot, going through the goal. The goal umpire, confronted by 2 mud-covered players, credited the kick to Essendon's Bryce and gave the Bombers the goal. Then, a couple of lucky breaks for Melbourne. Some great play by Norm Smith and Roy Dowsing, resulting in a vital goal to Ron Baggett, putting the Demons 10 points up. Ted Bryce kicked 1 more goal for Essendon, getting them to within 4 points. But they could not get that one last goal to take the lead. There was just minutes left, and the ball was in Melbourne's forward line. Albie Rodder had the last kick of the day, scoring a behind as the bell rang. A 5-point win to Melbourne, with just 16 fit men on the ground. It was a remarkable game. Essendon had done much more than just make up numbers in their return to finals football, and the injury-stuck Demons needed to work out how to put a team on the field for the grand final. Albie Rodder had kicked 3 goals, but could not remember anything about the game, a reminder of the changing attitudes in dealing with concussion during and after games. In the 1940 grand final, Richmond were led by their veteran captain-coach, Percy Bentley. There had been turmoil regarding his role at the start of the year, but he'd got the team into another grand final. Originally from Castlemaine, he was appointed captain in 1932 under then Richmond coach Frank Checo Hughes. He led the team to the 1932 Premiership and took over as captain-coach in 1934, winning another Premiership and then leading the team to finals in 5 out of 7 seasons. During summers, he kept himself fit playing cricket with Burnley, playing tennis, and long beach runs and swims. He had demonstrated leadership qualities from childhood, able to judge character and develop an understanding of teammates, so as to know what to say or how to motivate them. His wife, Jean, declared that Percy was full of confidence and without fear, but more importantly, was able to inspire others to be confident in themselves too. The grand final would be his 263rd and last game for the Tigers. But more on that next episode. Melbourne's captain was Alan LaFontaine, looking to lead his side into back-to-back premierships in his 125th game for Melbourne. He had started with Melbourne as a forward in 1934, but moved to the centre and had been appointed captain in just his 3rd season. In recognition of his pivotal role in Melbourne's history, he was named in the centre in the club's Team of the Century. Melbourne were also led by non-playing coach Frank Checo Hughes, taking on the Tigers, who he had coached in 4 grand finals, finally winning his first premiership as coach in 1932. Yet the following season he was at Melbourne. The offer of a full-time job at Percy Page's printing business was too compelling to ignore in the depths of the Depression. He had rebranded the club as the Demons and lifted them from cellar dwellers to reigning premiers. When asked why he selected Hughes to be coach of Melbourne, Page said, "He knows the game backward, but above all else, he is intensely interested in his players. He is a man among them and their friend. He gets results from the most temperamental fellows. I have seen his frank and blunt manner and his sympathetic understanding overcoming the sulks and tantrums of the most difficult player. What's there in the team, he brings out." There have been many changes in coaching styles and methods over the decades, but I reckon that description of man management would apply to successful coaches in any era. The umpire for the 1940 Grand Final was Alan Coward. It was his second Grand Final, but unlike the 1939 decider, he would not be injured and he would umpire the entire Grand Final this time. He had umpired the second semi-final and the preliminary and got the nod for the big match. Richmond made one change at the selection table. Charlie Priestley was the unfortunate player. He was in his third season and had played 17 games, even kicking a goal in the semi-final against Melbourne. The Tigers chose high-marking, tall Jack Crane, 19th man in the semi-final, and put Leo Merritt into the side to sit on the bench for his 11th game of the season. Often, a player dropped for the grand final will leave a club, but Charles swallowed his disappointment and played on until 1947, then served on the executive committee and the board of directors for 36 years, including 14 years on the selection committee, where as chair he would have had to make similar hard decisions that saw him miss out on a grand final in 1940. He was a true clubman. Melbourne struggled to pick a team with all the injuries and knocks suffered in the two finals. Definitely out was Wally Locke with his injured ankle, missing his second grand final in a row after being suspended in 1939. They finalised their team just before the game started. Ruckman Rowley Fisher was out with an injured ankle, Bill Baxter couldn't play, and Roy Dowsing was omitted. Into the side came Jack O'Keefe in the ruck after missing both finals. Fred Fanning in his first season was in the forward pocket in just his fifth game. Veteran Bluey Truscott, already enlisted in the RAAF and in training camp, was back after his leg kept him out of the preliminary final. Perhaps not perfectly fit, but good enough to play, joined by long-time defender Frank Roberts, a fullback, after missing the preliminary final. It was a team that mixed youth and experience from a club that had led the season. But Richmond were rested, injury-free, and full of confidence, which is why most previews favoured the Tigers. But Checker Hughes had a plan. 69,000 were at the ground, and they had to sit or stand in rain that fell from 11 a.m. The Reserves Grand Final was played as a curtain raiser rather than as a standalone match on the showday holiday. There had been doubts about having a showday holiday this year, and there was only a modified royal show at the Exhibition Gardens. Many businesses kept working the whole day. Times were different now. So the curtain raiser was between Collingwood and Carlton, played in front of the huge crowd who'd got there early to get their seats. One of the consistent and predictable elements of Grand Final Day for many years had been the appearance of Collingwood and the influence of McHale on the game. While the Magpies did not make it in the senior finals, Jock's son John was captaining the reserves team. The Magpies had made a strategic decision in the second half of the season when it was clear the first 18 would not be finalists, by keeping the reserves team intact so they could have a successful season. Several players, including John McHale and a young Lou Richards, might normally have got some games in the seniors, but not this season. The plan worked and Collingwood reserves beat Carlton by 22 points. Jock McHale had the rare pleasure of being a proud father watching the game rather than the intensely focused coach. But he was still assessing players for the future. After the game, in the happy change rooms, Jock McHale spoke to the 17-year-old Lou Richards, grandson of Charlie Panham, who had captained McHale. Jock said, "Young Richards, well played today, son. You'll be a Collingwood player." Richards couldn't wait to get home to tell his parents the great news from the revered icon of Victoria Park. Melbourne had put a maze of paper ribbons and balloons across the race in the now established tradition, while Richmond supporters also had put a big yellow and black sheet up behind the punt road goals. When Richmond ran onto the field, they had a miniature tiger mascot accompanying them. Closer inspection revealed a large dog wearing a black and yellow robe. It had rained on the Friday, and the rain started falling again just before the game started. It was good for league finances. They had taken out rain insurance and collected a £1,000 cheque by half-time. Not so good for those spectators that were not able to get undercover, and not so good if you were looking for a spectacular game. From the very first bounce, it seemed Melbourne were on top. Dyer had been pivotal in Richmond's success during the season, and notably in the first semi-final. Jackie Hughes selected Jack O'Keefe with one job in mind. Follow Jack Dyer. Bustle Jack Dyer. Put Jack Dyer off his game. And most important of all, keep Jack Dyer away from Melbourne's attacking players. To support O'Keefe, Melbourne players were told to keep the ball away from Dyer as much as possible. Make him use up energy chasing after the ball. Mueller, a noted match winner for the Demons, was not to play on Dyer at any point. For one of the few times in his long career, Jack Dyer had little impact on the game. He later said it was a game he preferred to forget, and noted that the umpire had cautioned him about 4 times in 4 minutes, so if he took matters into his own hands, he was gone. You can hear Dyer review a short video of the 1940 Grand Final with Stephen Phillips on Rhett Bartlett's retrospective YouTube channel. I'll put a link up on the show notes. Well worth a look. Other elements of the plan involved keeping backman Kevin O'Neill on his wrong foot as much as possible. Frank Roberts, with his noted strength and vigour, was given the job of blanketing Jack Titus. Full forward Norman Smith played almost a defensive forward role, staying shoulder to shoulder with fullback George Smeaton. The other forwards then had to be on the move all the time. Whenever Smeaton punched the ball away from Hughes, there was a Melbourne forward on the move to pick it up. The plan worked perfectly. Melbourne gave Richmond a football lesson. While Melbourne moved the ball with ease, the Tigers were clumsy, awkward in the groundwork, and uncoordinated. The only thing that did not go as planned for the Demons was a back injury to Ray Wortman, who was taken from the ground in the first quarter and replaced with Ron Barassi Sr. The quarter-time scores flattered the Tigers. Melbourne 4 goals 8-31 to Richmond 3 goals 18 points. It was only a 14-point gap, but Melbourne had played much better football. By half-time, the game was as good as done. The Demons 10 goals 11-71 to Richmond 4 goals 2-26. Half-time entertainment was provided by the Army Band from Puckapunyal, joining a number of players such as Harold Ball and Ron Barassi Sr., who had also travelled from their military commitments at Puckapunyal to play the game. The second half saw a better performance by Richmond. The weather dried up, and they actually outscored Melbourne in the last 2 quarters, but the gap was too much to be overcome. One of the few items of interest in the second half was whether Jack Titus would reach his ton. He scored his 3rd goal in the last quarter, and a cheer went around the ground from all supporters in recognition of his achievement, while players from both sides took time to shake his hand, including Roberts, who had done so much to limit Titus's impact in this game. It was a bittersweet moment for Titus. He'd played since 1926, and this was his 6th losing grand final. He had won 2 premierships in 1932 and 34, but he would be forgiven for feeling that he'd got the balance wrong. The final scores were Melbourne 15 goals 17, 107 to Richmond 10 goals 8, 68. Melbourne had played in 4 grand finals in the VFL, and they'd won every single time. The usual speeches were given in the Melbourne rooms after the game, and Richmond officials visited to pay their congratulations, conceding the best team had won the premiership. In the modern era, players have to deal with some outrageous and inappropriate comments made by anonymous keyboard warriors using various social media platforms. After the game, it was revealed that Jack Dyer had received a stream of vicious letters making threats to him, as well as his wife and mother. Perhaps some aspects of human nature don't change. Dyer's reaction was disgust and a request that such people keep their thoughts to themselves or be prepared to come to him face to face and try and deliver the same vile message, and then see what might happen. The following week saw 30,800 at the MCG to watch Port Melbourne play Paran in the VFA Grand Final. It was another fast-moving game, showcasing the throw rule and the other changes that the VFA had introduced. Port won the game easily, and Austin Robinson finally had a premiership after missing South Melbourne's only triumph when he was in the USA in 1933. While the VFA and the VFL could not come to terms, it was the real war that was drawing people's attention. It's worth noting that 4 of Melbourne's premiership team, Harold Ball, Sid Anderson, Keith Truscott and Ron Barassi Sr., would all be killed before the war was over. The coming seasons were going to be challenging on and off the field. Before we finish this episode, I just want to touch on the long legacy of Ron Todd's defection to Williamstown. In 1997, over 50 years after the events described in this podcast, Collingwood decided to name a Team of the Century. The league had celebrated 100 seasons of football in 1996, and Teams of the Century were on the minds of most clubs. A selection committee was chosen, including Kevin Rose as chair, Ron Richards, journalists Eddie Maguire and Trevor Grant, and John McHale, son of Jock and captain of the reserves Premiership team of 1940, before he went on to play 34 senior games. Todd was selected at centre-half forward, with Gordon Coventry at full forward and Dick Lee on the half-forward flank. Quite a challenge, fitting those three into one forward line. Before the team was announced, Trevor Grant received a phone call from Kevin Rose. John McHale had said little during the meeting, but later spoke to Rose. He insisted, demanded that Ron Todd be excluded. The traitor could not be celebrated in the Team of the Century. Murray Wiedemann, a very good player, but no Ron Todd, was selected at centre-half forward instead. Grant confirmed in 2013 that any objection was useless. A man with the name McHale was always going to have his way at Collingwood. Todd was eventually inducted into Collingwood's Hall of Fame in 2011 and the Australian Football Hall of Fame in 2017. But his exclusion from Collingwood's Team of the Century over 50 years after his departure from Collingwood shows some level of the price he paid for that fateful decision. If you've enjoyed Grand Final History, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or you want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook or Twitter or Blue Sky for more Grand Final History.